The crystal chandelier sparkled magnificently in Arthur Williams' mansion, casting a golden glow over the gathering of Sao Paulo's elite. At 32, Arthur had everything money could buy, yet the emptiness in his eyes told a different story. He stood near the marble fireplace, swirling his aged whiskey, watching his guests with detachment. The party, like countless others before it, felt hollow. Arthur, darling, Charlotte Montenegro, a socialite known for her sharp tongue and sharper wit, sashayed toward him. Another spectacular party, but you look absolutely miserable. What's the matter? Bored with all your millions? Her words drew knowing chuckles from the small crowd that had gathered around them. Arthur forced a smile, used to being the subject of such teasing. His reputation as Sao Paulo's most eligible bachelor had made him a constant target for gossip and speculation. Perhaps what our dear Arthur needs is a challenge, suggested Marcus Alvarez, his closest friend and business partner. Something to shake up this predictable life of luxury. Charlotte's eyes sparkled with mischief. A challenge? Oh, I have the perfect one. She raised her voice slightly, ensuring she had everyone's attention. Arthur Williams, I bet you can't get married within a month to someone completely outside our social circle. The room fell silent. Arthur's grip on his crystal glass tightened. And why would I accept such a ridiculous proposition? Because, Charlotte purred, you're dying for something real. Look around, Arthur. Everything in your life is calculated, controlled, cushioned by money. When was the last time you did something truly unpredictable? Marcus joined in, his voice carrying a note of challenge. I'll add to that bet. If you succeed, I'll donate $10 million to the charity of your choice. If you fail, you'll donate the same amount to Charlotte's foundation. Arthur's jaw clenched. He knew they were manipulating him, using his pride and his growing dissatisfaction with life against him. Yet something about the challenge stirred something inside him, a spark of excitement he hadn't felt in years. Fine, he declared, surprising even himself. But I choose where I go to find this bride. The next morning, nursing a slight hangover and questioning his sanity, Arthur found himself researching remote Brazilian coastal towns. His finger stopped on a small dot on the map. Porto do Sol, a picturesque village in the northeast. Something about the name called to him, Port of Sunday. Perhaps there, far from the artificial glitter of his world, he could find what he was looking for. Within hours, his private jet was ready. As Sao Paulo's skyscrapers disappeared beneath the clouds, Arthur closed his eyes, trying to quiet the voice in his head that kept asking if he'd lost his mind. The bed itself was absurd, but it had become something more, an escape route from the golden cage he'd built around himself. Porto do Sol appeared below, like a painting come to life. Colorful houses dotted the coastline. Fishing boats bobbed in the crystal-clear waters, and palm trees swayed in the gentle breeze. As his helicopter descended on the outskirts of town, the closest landing spot his pilot could find, Arthur felt like he'd stepped into another world. The heat hit him immediately, along with the salty smell of the ocean and the sound of distant waves. His designer suit, perfect for Sao Paulo's corporate world, felt ridiculous here. A few curious locals stopped to stare as he made his way into town, rolling his Louis Vuitton suitcase along the unpaved street. He found himself in the town square, where a group of children were gathered around a young woman. She was reading to them, her voice animated as she brought the story to life. Her dark curls danced in the breeze, and her simple sundress seemed to capture the essence of this place. Unpretentious, yet beautiful. That's Maria, an elderly voice said beside him. Arthur turned to find a woman with kind eyes and silver hair watching him. She teaches at our community center. Are you lost, young man? We don't get many visitors in suits around here. I'm Arthur Williams, he replied, extending his hand. And no, I'm not lost. At least, I don't think I am. The woman, who introduced herself as Dona Rosa, studied him with knowing eyes. Ah, but sometimes we must get lost to find ourselves, Neo, eh? She smiled mysteriously. Come, You look like you could use a cup of coffee and some shade. And perhaps I can tell you more about our little Porto do Sol." As Arthur followed Donna Rosa to her small cafe, he couldn't help looking back at Maria and her students. She hadn't noticed him yet, too engrossed in her storytelling. Something about her presence, the way the children looked at her with such adoration, made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar feeling. Little did he know that this moment, this decision to follow an elderly woman into her modest cafe, would be the first step in a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about wealth, happiness, and love. Porto do Sol was about to teach Sao Paulo's most eligible bachelor lessons that no amount of money could buy. Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her brow as she finished organizing the community center's modest library. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the worn but carefully maintained books. Her students had left an hour ago, but their enthusiasm still echoed in her mind. Teaching wasn't just her profession, it was her calling. Maria, her brother Joao burst through the door, his usually calm demeanor disturbed. "Have you heard? There's a millionaire in town, some businessman from Sao Paulo. He's been asking questions about you." She rolled her eyes, continuing to stack books. "Joao, you worry too much. What would a millionaire want with me?" Before Joao could respond, a knock at the door frame made them both turn. Arthur Williams stood there, looking somewhat less polished than when he'd arrived. He'd abandoned his suit jacket, and his crisp white shirt was slightly wrinkled from the heat. "Miss Santos?" Arthur stepped forward, his practiced charm slightly faltering under Joao's protective glare. "I'm Arthur Williams. I was hoping we could talk." Maria studied him carefully, noting the expensive watch on his wrist and the way he carried himself, like someone used to getting what he wanted. "I'm in the middle of organizing the library, Mr. Williams. Unless you're here to donate books or support our literacy program, I'm afraid I'm quite busy." Arthur glanced around the modest room, taking in the peeling paint and the carefully mended furniture. This wasn't the reception he'd expected. In his world, people jumped at the chance to speak with Arthur Williams. "Actually, I have a proposition that could help your program and the entire community." Joao stepped between them. "Whatever you're selling, we're not interested." "Joao," Maria warned, though she appreciated her brother's protective instinct. She turned to Arthur. "Mr. Williams, why don't you tell me about this proposition over coffee at Donna Rosa's? At least there, if your offer is as absurd as I suspect it might be, I can enjoy a good cup of cafe while hearing it." Arthur found himself following Maria through the bustling streets of Porto do Sol. Children called out greetings to her. Elderly women blessed her as she passed, and fishermen tipped their hats. She was clearly beloved here, and Arthur began to understand why. At Donna Rosa's cafe, Maria chose a table near the window, where the sea breeze could reach them. Donna Rosa appeared with coffee without being asked, giving Arthur a knowing smile that made him wonder what she'd already figured out. "So, Mr. Williams," Maria began, adding sugar to her coffee, "what brings Sao Paulo's famous bachelor to our humble Porto do Sol?" Arthur nearly choked on his coffee. "You know who I am. We may be a small town, but we have internet," she replied dryly. "Your face appears quite regularly in business magazines and social columns. Though I must admit, I never expected to find you here." Taking a deep breath, Arthur decided on honesty, or at least a version of it. "I'm looking for something real, Miss Santos. Something meaningful. And I think you might be able to help me find it. Please call me Maria. And how exactly do you think I can help you find meaning?" "Marry me." The words hung in the air between them. Maria's coffee cup stopped halfway to her lips, and somewhere in the background, Donna Rosa dropped a plate. "I must have misheard you," Maria said carefully. "You didn't. I'm proposing marriage. In return, I'll ensure your community center never wants for funding again. I'll establish a foundation to support education initiatives throughout the region. Your students will have opportunities they never dreamed possible." Maria's eyes flashed with anger, Mr. Williams, I don't know how things work in your world, but here, marriage isn't a business transaction. And my students aren't bargaining chips. She started to rise, but Arthur caught her wrist gently. Please hear me out. I know how this sounds, but you have no idea how this sounds, she interrupted, pulling her hand away. You waltz in here, thinking you can buy whatever you want, including people's lives and feelings. We may not have much in Porto do Sol, but we have dignity and self-respect. Just then, an elderly man entered the cafe, his presence causing Maria to freeze. Arthur noticed how her face paled slightly at the sight of him. Ah, Maria, the man said, his friendly tone carrying an undercurrent of threat. I trust you haven't forgotten about our discussion regarding your family's debt? The deadline is approaching. No! Mr. Oliveira, I haven't forgotten, Maria replied, her voice tight. Arthur watched the interaction with growing interest. There was clearly more happening here than met the eye. As Mr. Oliveira left, Maria seemed to deflate slightly, the weight of some hidden burden visible in her shoulders. Perhaps, Arthur said quietly, we could help each other. I'm not asking for love, Maria. I'm asking for 1 month of your time. After that, if you want nothing to do with me, I'll still fulfill my promises to the community. Maria looked at him for a long moment, conflict clear in her eyes. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. 1 month, 1 month, he confirmed. And everything I promised for the community center becomes reality, regardless of what you decide afterward. As the sun began to set over Porto do Sol, casting long shadows through Dona Rosa's cafe windows, Maria found herself facing an impossible choice. The future of her community, her family's security, and her own principles hung in the balance. And across the table sat Arthur Williams, a man who represented everything she distrusted about the world of wealth and privilege, offering what seemed like both salvation and surrender. The news of Maria's engagement to Arthur Williams spread through Porto do Sol like wildfire. Within days, the small coastal town was buzzing with speculation and whispered conversations. Arthur had taken residence in the town's only posada, refusing the comfort of luxury hotels in nearby cities, determined to immerse himself in local life. One morning, as Arthur walked along the beach, he encountered Dona Rosa collecting shells. Ah, the man who thinks he can buy happiness, she said, not looking up from her task. Tell me, Menino, are you beginning to understand yet? Understand what? Arthur asked, helping her pick up a particularly beautiful shell. That some things must be earned, not purchased. She straightened up, fixing him with her wise eyes. Maria agreed to your arrangement, but her heart is like the shell, beautiful, but closed tight. It will take more than money to open it. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of children's laughter. At the community center's playground, Maria was organizing what appeared to be an impromptu soccer game. Arthur watched as she tied a little girl's shoelaces. Her face lit up with genuine joy. Why don't you join them? Dona Rosa suggested. Sometimes the best way to understand a person's world is to step into it. Hesitantly, Arthur approached the playground. The children eyed him curiously. The man in expensive casual were who stood out like a peacock among sparrows. Maria looked up, surprise flickering across her face. Mr. Williams, she said formally, still maintaining distance despite their engagement. I didn't expect to see you here. Please call me Arthur, he replied, loosening his designer watch and placing it safely aside. Need another player? The next hour transformed Arthur's understanding of Maria's world. He played soccer with children who wore worn-out shoes but had boundless enthusiasm. He heard their stories, of dreams bigger than their circumstances, of parents working multiple jobs, of the hope that education might offer them a different future. Maria watched him with growing curiosity as he let himself get muddy, laughed genuinely, and treated each child with respect. For a moment, she glimpsed something beyond the wealthy businessman, a glimpse of someone who might actually care. Later that afternoon, as they walked through the town square, Maria finally spoke about what had been weighing on her mind. The debt to Mr. Oliveira, it wasn't just my parents' mistake. They trusted him, invested their savings in what they thought was a legitimate business opportunity. He manipulated them, like he's done to many others in town. Arthur listened intently, his business mind already working. Why hasn't anyone challenged him legally? In small towns like this, things work differently. He has connections, influence, and now he's planning to turn Porto do Sol into some exclusive resort destination. Our community center sits on prime beachfront property. The pieces started falling into place in Arthur's mind. The debt, the pressure, the timing of it all. That's why you agreed to marry me, he said softly. You're hoping my influence can protect the town. Maria stopped walking, turning to face him. I agreed because I'm desperate to save what matters most. This center, these children, this community, it's everything to me. But don't mistake my acceptance for trust, Arthur. Men like you, who see everything as a transaction, are part of the problem. Her words stung more than he expected. You don't know me, Maria, don't I? I've seen your type before. You sweep in with grand promises and good intentions, but in the end, it's all about profit and prestige. These children aren't a charity case for you to feel good about yourself. Before Arthur could respond, Joao appeared, his face tense. Maria, we need to talk. Privately, Arthur watched them walk away, noting the urgent whispers and Maria's growing concern. He pulled out his phone, making a call to his office in Sao Paulo. I need everything you can find on Eduardo Oliveira and his business dealings in Porto do Sol. As days passed, Arthur found himself drawn deeper into the community's life. He attended local festivals, learned traditional dances, albeit clumsily, and spent more time at the community center. The children began to warm to him, especially after he started bringing new books and art supplies. But it was his conversations with Dona Rosa that truly began to change him. She shared stories of Porto do Sol's history, of communities supporting each other through hardships, of wealth that couldn't be measured in bank accounts. One evening, as Arthur sat alone on the beach watching the sunset, Maria found him. She held a stack of papers, her hands trembling slightly. I found these in Joao's research, she said, handing them to him. Your company, Williams Enterprises, has been quietly buying up coastal properties all along the Northeast, converting traditional communities into luxury developments. Arthur felt his world tilt. He hadn't been directly involved in those projects. They were handled by the company's development division, but his name, his family's legacy, was all over them. Maria, I didn't know. Save it. She cut him off, her voice breaking slightly. I was right about you all along. This whole marriage arrangement, was it just a way to add Porto do Sol to your collection? As she walked away, leaving Arthur with the damning evidence of his company's actions, he realized that saving his relationship with Maria would require more than grand gestures or financial solutions. It would require him to confront the very foundation of who he was and what he stood for. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. In the distance, fishing boats returned to harbor, their lights twinkling like stars fallen to earth. Arthur Williams, who had always known exactly who he was and what he wanted, found himself adrift in unfamiliar waters, searching for a new direction. The morning sun cast long shadows across Arthur's desk in his posada room, where documents and financial reports lay scattered. He hadn't slept, spending the night analyzing every project his company had undertaken along Brazil's coast. Each page revealed a pattern he'd been too disconnected to notice before. Communities displaced, traditional ways of life disrupted, all in the name of profit. A knock at his door revealed Dona Rosa, carrying a tray of coffee and pão de queijo. You look terrible, meu filho, she said, setting down the tray. Sometimes the hardest mirror to face is the one that shows us who we really are. I've been blind, Dona Rosa, Arthur admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. My family's wealth, it's built on destroying places exactly like Porto do Sol. The question is, she replied, pouring him coffee, what will you do with that knowledge? Before he could respond, commotion erupted outside. They rushed to the window to see a crowd gathering in the town square. Mr. Oliveira stood on the steps of the municipal building, addressing the townspeople with what appeared to be architectural renderings. Arthur and Dona Rosa hurried down to join the crowd. Maria was already there, her face pale with anger as Mr. Oliveira unveiled his plans for Porto do Sol Resort and Spa, a massive development that would essentially erase the existing town. Progress is inevitable, Oliveira announced smoothly. This development will bring jobs, tourism, prosperity. Those who cooperate will be generously compensated, and those who don't, João challenged, standing protectively near Maria. Oliveira's smile didn't reach his eyes. As I was saying, the project has already received preliminary approval from regional authorities. Construction begins in 2 months. The crowd erupted in protests. Arthur watched as Maria tried to calm the elderly fishermen who were shouting about their generations-old fishing rights, while mothers clutched their children, whispering worriedly about having to leave their homes. Suddenly, Carlos, Maria's former suitor, stepped forward. Perhaps we should ask Mr. Williams about this development. After all, isn't this what his company specializes in? All eyes turned to Arthur. Maria's gaze was particularly piercing, a mix of hurt and resignation, as if her worst fears had been confirmed. Arthur stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square. Yes, my company has been involved in similar projects. And yes, I've profited from them without considering the true cost. But standing here today, I see everything wrong with that approach. He turned to face Oliveira. You're right about one thing. Progress is inevitable. But it doesn't have to come at the expense of community and tradition. Arthur pulled out his phone, dialing a number on speaker. Marcus, remember that charity donation we discussed? I want to make it now, but with a specific purpose. I'm transferring controlling interest in Williams' coastal development to a community trust, starting with Porto do Sol. The crowd fell silent. Even Oliveira's composed facade cracked slightly. Arthur, Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker. That division is worth. I know exactly what it's worth, Arthur interrupted. Do it, and one more thing. I want a full investigation into all local development projects, including any involving Eduardo Oliveira. Oliveira's face darkened. You're making a serious mistake, Williams. This isn't your fight. Actually, it is, Arthur replied, moving to stand beside Maria. You see, I made a bet that I could find something real in 1 month. What I found was the truth about myself, about wealth, about what really matters. He turned to address the crowd. Porto do Sol doesn't need to be transformed into another soulless resort. It needs to be preserved, protected, and allowed to grow on its own terms. I'm proposing a different kind of development, one that enhances what's already here instead of replacing it. Maria stared at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. Why would you sacrifice so much? Because you were right about me, Maria. I was part of the problem. But standing here in this place with these people, I finally understand what real wealth looks like. It's not in bank accounts or property portfolios. It's in communities like this, in the way people care for each other, in the dreams you're nurturing in those children. The crowd began to murmur, but this time with growing excitement as Arthur outlined his alternative vision. A plan to develop sustainable tourism that would preserve the town's character while providing opportunities for growth. The community center would be expanded, not relocated. Traditional businesses would be supported, not replaced. As the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows for that brief moment, Arthur realized that he too had reached a turning point where there was nowhere to hide from his truth. The bet that had brought him to Porto do Sol as a privileged playboy had transformed him into someone else entirely. Someone who finally understood the difference between price and value. But even as hope began to bloom in the town square, Dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Oliveira slipped away from the crowd, his face set in grim determination, while Carlos watched the scene unfold with calculating eyes. The battle for Porto do Sol's soul was far from over, and Arthur's dramatic gesture had raised the stakes higher than anyone could have imagined. The evening before the town's decisive community meeting, Porto do Sol's beach hosted an unprecedented gathering. Colorful lanterns swayed in the ocean breeze, and tables laden with local delicacies stretched along the shore. Arthur had organized the celebration not just as a show of support, but as a testament to what the community could achieve together. Maria watched from the edge of the festivities, her heart conflicted. Over the past month, she'd witnessed Arthur's transformation from a privileged outsider to someone who genuinely cared about Porto do Sol's fate. His sacrifice of the Coastal Development Division had shocked everyone, but it was his daily actions that truly spoke volumes. Helping fishermen repair their nets, tutoring children in English, and learning to dance foro with the elderly at the community center. He's not the same man who arrived here, Dona Rosa said, appearing beside Maria with her usual mysterious smile. Sometimes the greatest journeys are the ones that transform our hearts. Before Maria could respond, Carlos approached them, his expression serious. Maria, there's something you need to see. He held out a tablet displaying financial records. I've been investigating Williams Enterprises. Their charitable foundation, it's all a tax scheme. Even this latest move, it's probably just a publicity stunt to rebrand their image. Maria felt her chest tighten. Despite everything, doubt crept in like the evening tide. She looked across the beach where Arthur was teaching a group of children how to fly kites, his expensive clothes covered in sand, his laughter genuine. Meanwhile, Arthur was fighting his own battle. Earlier that day, he received a call from his board of directors questioning his recent decisions. The transfer of the Coastal Division had sent shockwaves through the business world, and shareholders were demanding explanations. As the sun began to set, casting the beach in golden light, Arthur found Maria standing alone by the water's edge. "You're worried about tomorrow," he said softly. "I'm worried about everything," she admitted. "Arthur, why are you really doing all this? The truth, please." He took a deep breath, watching the waves crash against the shore. "When I first came here, it was because of a bet, a foolish, arrogant bet made by a man who thought he could buy happiness. But Porto do Sol taught me something invaluable. Through you, through these people, I learned that real wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you give back. And your company, your shareholders, let them worry," he replied firmly. "I've spent my entire life building wealth without purpose. Here, I found purpose. That's worth more than any business deal." Their conversation was interrupted by commotion near the community center. Oliveira had arrived with a team of lawyers and developers, carrying new documents and proposals. The celebration quieted as he approached the gathering. "I'm afraid Mr. Williams' generous offer won't be necessary," Oliveira announced smugly. "I've secured final approval for the resort development. By law, the town has no choice but to accept the terms." Arthur stepped forward, but it was Maria who spoke first. "Actually, Mr. Oliveira, you might want to review these." She produced a folder of documents that Joao had helped compile. "We've found irregularities in every contract you force people to sign. The community never received proper legal representation, and several environmental impact studies were falsified." Oliveira's confidence wavered slightly. "These accusations are baseless." "Are they?" Arthur interrupted, pulling out his phone. "Because my legal team has been working with federal authorities to investigate your entire operation. It seems your resort project violates several environmental protection laws and indigenous land rights." The crowd began to murmur as Oliveira's face reddened with anger. "You're making a grave mistake, both of you. This town needs this development to survive." "No," Maria declared, her voice carrying across the beach. "What this town needs is to preserve its soul while growing on its own terms. And thanks to Arthur's community trust, we now have the resources to do exactly that." As if on cue, the fishing boats in the harbor began sounding their horns, a traditional signal of celebration. The entire community seemed to rise up together, their voices united in support of their home's future. Oliveira, seeing his carefully constructed plans crumbling, stormed away from the beach. Carlos lingered for a moment, looking between Maria and Arthur, before nodding slightly and following suit. In the joyous chaos that followed, Arthur turned to Maria. "I know our arrangement was for 1 month, and that time is almost up, but I'm not ready to leave Porto do Sol. More importantly, I'm not ready to leave you." Maria studied his face in the fading light. "The man I met a month ago was looking to win a bet. The man standing before me now has won something far more valuable. He's found himself. And what about us?" Arthur asked softly. Instead of answering, Maria took his hand and led him to where the townspeople were beginning to dance. The local band struck up a lively foro, and under the stars, with the whole community as witnesses, they danced, not as a wealthy businessman and a village teacher, but as two people who had found something real in the most unexpected place. As the celebration continued into the night, Dona Rosa watched the couple with satisfaction. She'd known from the moment Arthur arrived that Porto do Sol would either break him or remake him. The town had a way of stripping away pretenses, revealing the truth in people's hearts. The next morning, as the sun rose over Porto do Sol, it illuminated a community transformed not by luxury developments, but by the power of unity and authentic connection. Arthur and Maria stood on the beach, watching fishing boats head out to sea, their futures now intertwined with the town they both loved. "So," Maria said, smiling up at Arthur, "was it worth losing the bet?" Arthur pulled her close, finally understanding that some things in life were beyond any price tag. "Who says I lost? I think I won something far more valuable than I ever imagined possible,"